Good morning. Many people have been shocked by the last-minute evictions of residents down near Expo from the hostels. And there was a meeting last night to which Jimmy Patterson of Expo went to see if he could help. But there were a couple of oafs in the crowd who behaved like idiots. Watch Mark Schneider's report.
John, have you seen Margaret?
Expo President Jimmy Patterson worked his way through the overflow crowd in an East Vancouver meeting hall last night, prepared to take some flack. He and Mayor Mike Harcourt were both invited by the Downtown Eastside Residents Association to do something about the rash of hotel evictions. Evictions Dira blames on Expo as hotel owners cash in on the fare.
And I lived in that hotel for 26 years. And being told, and then on top, $19 for the night if I don't. But the thing is, what will they do to compensate these people from the gouging that is being done? Because this is strictly gouging for Expo 86.
I want to know all of these places you're talking about. I'm very interested in knowing what the
DERA organizer Jim Green tried to stop some of the eggs coming in a side door, but the damage is done.
To take to his board, which meets.
Outside, police have one egg-throwing suspect in custody, upset apparently not with the hotel evictions downtown, but with pornography. Although he's led away by police, Patterson says he won't lay any charges. The meeting continues inside, but with an angry Mike Harcourt.
There's an answer to that.
Mike knows
there's an answer to that. There's all over the place. Yeah. Landlords and twits like that. And all I'll say is, that one of the things I'm proud about in this city is you can get the leader of the downtown east side together with the chairman of Expo and BC Place and the mayor of this city to confront these issues and to be honest with each other. And that is not going to stop us from having a democratic city, I'll tell you that much.
Jimmy Patterson told the audience that he's going to meet with the board of Expo on Monday, and if they agree, he will go to Victoria with Jim Green of DERA and Mayor Harcourt to see if something can be done to stop these evictions. That's number one this morning. Number two this morning is Michael Walker of the Fraser Institute, because tomorrow's the big day when some conservative economists want to see gore on the floor when Michael Wilson delivers his budget, slashing goodness knows what not in the sake of reducing the deficit and bringing us into a good conservative state of money care. Also today, we're going to meet the Robert Freeman-Longo, who is a unit director of the Sex Offender Unit Correctional Treatment in Oregon State Hospital at Salem. And he's going to give us the benefit of his wisdom as to whether or not pedophiles and other sex offenders can be cured, treated, or should be confined. But off the top this morning, what Michael Walker expects from Wilson's budget after the break. We won't know until this afternoon what Finance Minister Michael Wilson, if he's been able to agree with Mulroney, is going to do to our tax system in this country. A lot of people are afraid that they're going to have enough gall to put additional taxes on gasoline, that he's going to wipe out many of the smaller benefits in the income tax to older people and dividend income and that kind of thing. But here is a good conservative economist from the Fraser Institute, the Michael Walker. Now, Michael Walker, forget what you think he's going to do. Give me the draconian measures you would bring in to make our economy healthy from a Tory point of view if you were the Minister of Finance.
Well, I don't think it's so much from a Tory point of view, Jack. What we really have to imagine ourselves is being here on a stage with a whole host of people in other countries, financial investors, foreign exchange traders, and so on, watching Michael Wilson's performance this afternoon and wondering what he's going to do, and ask ourselves, what would we do if we wanted to ensure that cast of observers out there would be satisfied, and hence not take some of the actions that we've seen them take during the first month after the new year to trade the Canadian dollar down and so on. So the kind of things we're talking about is not just a Tory or a conservative agenda, I think, Jack. We're talking about things now that we need to do to rehabilitate ourselves in the eyes of the world, economically speaking. And it's quite clear what that has to consist of. It has to consist of a cut in the deficit. We can go about that in essentially two ways. One is to cut spending. Two is to raise taxes. There aren't any other options. And my preferred approach to solving that problem is to cut spending. I think that we've gone about as far as we can go in raising taxes. I think many Canadians are beginning to agree with that. And so I think that we really ought to be cutting expenditures. And we can cut them, Jack, in a way that people would regard to be fair. We can cut off, for example, access to those so-called universal programs by people who've got adequate incomes. We can cut off people over $40,000 on the universal programs. We can save nearly $5 billion. We can modify the unemployment insurance program, Jack, so that people in this country whose incomes are above the average are not getting the lion's share of the benefits, as happens at the moment. And we can save another $4 billion. We can save a lot of money by looking at our expenditure programs and saying there are people in this country who are benefiting from government programs who simply don't need the money.
What are you saying by that? You're saying, first of all, no more taxation. Business must not be burdened with any more taxation.
It's not businessmen, Jack. Businessmen don't pay the taxes. Even if the taxes are put on corporations, it isn't the businessman who pays the taxes. You pay the taxes when Imperial Oil and other people have tax bills levied on them because you have Imperial Oil shares in your pension fund. But that's just nonsense to say that the corporations
What you want to do is cut the services to people. You don't want to cut the civil service anymore, even although Eric Nielsen is talking about 15,000 being removed over the next few years, isn't he?
Jack, it's not a matter of cutting the services to people. I mean,
cutting the allowances to people.
Look, we're kidding ourselves. What we're doing right now is we're borrowing money from our children, and we're reassigning it and giving it to people whose incomes are above the average. That's the way to look at it. We've got a deficit of $30 billion that we're borrowing from our children, and we're giving it to people who right now, whose incomes are $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. It's just stupid.
Be specific. Be specific. Let's go to UIC first of all. You're saying that anyone who earns $40,000 in the previous year should not be able to draw UIC?
No, not in the previous year.
Right
now, they shouldn't. Anybody who's earning $40,000 a year is earning an income, a family income, well above the average. Let me just tell you the facts of the unemployment insurance. Wait a minute.
Let me give you another one. Would you also stop 2 unemployment insurance checks going to 1 unit?
I wouldn't have any view at all about how many unemployment checks go to 1 unit. What I would say is this: that if the income of that family unit is above the national average, then there's no way we ought to be taking money from people whose incomes are below the average and giving it to those families. That's crazy. And that's exactly what we're doing now.
And you would save how many billion in UIC?
This is very graphic, Jack. When the unemployment insurance fund started in 1971, 30% of the benefits went to those whose incomes were above the average. Okay, so we were making a mistake right from the beginning.
Well, that
but it was only 30%.
Yeah. $100 a week for everybody.
Now it's more than 50%, Jack. More than half of all the benefits are going to people whose incomes are above the average. Well, I think that's, given the fact that we're all paying into it, from the lowest income individual to the highest income, I think it's crazy that we should be allocating that money to the high income, especially when we're borrowing $30 billion a year. So there's no question on my mind, we've got to do something about this.
That's $4 billion.
But, well, the McDonald Commission recommended that, or estimated that we could save as much as $4 billion.
And you would also shorten the length of the qualification period and shorten the benefit period.
Well, if we're going to talk about there are a whole host of modifications to the unemployment insurance that we have recommended. They range from experience rating all the way through, and it's too complicated, I think, for us this morning.
What about your other cuts? You're not talking only about UIC. What other cuts would you make?
Universality, Jack. The
family
universal
allowances.
Family allowances.
Old age pensions.
Well, not Canada Assistance. Canada Assistance is not going. Oh, Canada Assistance is the only plan that we know for sure is not going to people whose incomes are above the average. But there are, there are billions of dollars. Billions of
assistance is welfare.
Billions of dollars going to families whose incomes are above the average, and it just doesn't make any sense.
Scrap family allowance for those getting more than 40,000. Scrap old age pensions for those over 65 earning more than 40,000. Scrap Canada pension plan, CPP.
No, that's not that calculation is not even in the
How much would that save you if you wiped out the universality, which the Tories talked about?
Yeah.
How much would that save you?
They murmured about it, Jack, I think would be the only word. They didn't really talk, mumbled about it. Well, it was $4.5 billion in 1 year, $4.5 billion.
And then, of course, if we stopped rescuing the bank failures, $1.6 billion into CCB in Northland, wasn't that abominable?
Yes, sure.
So really, Mulroney's a failure from your point of view.
Well, there are a lot of things about that this government has done that would have to be classed as Fs. And as you know, Jack, in September we gave them a report card. They got one A, they got several Bs, and they got mostly Fs.
Who was the A?
Pat Kearney.
Who was the B? Oh.
They got a B on for denationalizing to some extent and moving in the direction of denationalizing some of those government-owned industries. They got some Bs also for carrying on the deregulation of transportation and those.
What rating did you give the wee Mulroney?
Well, overall, I mean, the guy rated the whole government. I didn't rate him as an individual. We talked about some of their activities.
He tried to de-index the old age pensions. No, Wilson tried to de-index the old age pensions until it was more than 3%, and he chickened out.
No, but wait a minute, Jack. I mean, I don't know anything about politics, Jack, and I'd be the first one to admit it. But here's a case where they went in after $20 million. They challenged 2.5 million old age pensioners. If they had taken our advice and they had gone after high-income old age pensioners, like I've proposed here this morning, they could have saved billions of dollars and challenged only a few 100,000 people. So from a political point of view, what they did was simply dumb. They challenged the maximum number of people for the minimal amount of gain on the expenditure.
And yet they brought in some advantages for the rich, the well-off people last year with a $500,000 cumulative capital gain in a lifetime business, right?
Well,
was that a good thing, or was that just a giveaway to friends of the government?
Well, in the context of what we have been recommending, let's put it this way, that was not one of the things that we recommended.
Michael Walker's quite bright this morning, Fraser Institute. Many of you will regard him as a pure reactionary who would think it's proper to collect debt to pay allowances to the poorer sections of our society. But your proposition, 40,000 the cut-off limit. Wipe out these people.
Jack, just a minute here. What we're talking about in this deficit, people sometimes just fool themselves, Deficits are nothing more than deferred taxes. And what's really involved in $30 billion deficits is borrowing money from our children, because our children are going to have to pay for that in the form of higher taxes. We're deferring those taxes to the future, and we're keeping those spending programs up there, and we're kidding ourselves. We're saying, look, we can afford to spend this money, we can afford universality, because we can borrow the money. We can borrow the $30 billion.
And you say
it's just
we
ridiculous.
Cannot afford it.
Well, you see, the clear message that came across the foreign exchange markets in January was that we can't afford it now, in the sense that what do we find ourselves doing, Jack? We don't cut the deficit. The exchange rate goes to hell. What does the government do by reaction? It raises interest rates. It raises interest rates to defend the dollar. The net effect is to drive down housing starts, to stop job creation in that sector, to stop people from buying automobiles and refrigerators and everything else that depends on interest rates. And what do we find ourselves doing? We find ourselves creating unemployment or destroying economic activity because we haven't done anything about the deficit.
Your questions to Michael Walker, but I want to get his more realistic predictions for this afternoon's budget. But we'll take questions too after the break. We will now have the predictions for today's budget from Michael Walker of the Fraser Institute. Will he wipe out RRSPs?
No, Jack, first of all, I'm going to tell you that this is a futile activity.
I know it
predicting what's going to be. I used to work in the Department of Finance, Jack. I used to do the simulations of the budget packages on a computer model that I had built for the Department of Finance. And when I went home on budget night, my wife always knew more about what was in the budget than I did. So let's be clear here that this is not a... I think that it isn't going to be a draconian budget in the sense that he's going to wipe out $10 billion worth of expenditures or anything of that kind. But he clearly faces the challenge that if he doesn't come up with, relative to what people now expect, if he doesn't come up with about $7 billion worth of tax increases and expenditure reductions.
Combination of.
Combination of. Now, some of that revenue increase, Jack, will come about simply because of growth in the economy. The economy is growing pretty robustly now across Canada, and so he is going to get some of it for free, as it were. That with the given income tax rates and with the given excise tax rates and so on, he'll get more revenue simply because of more growth.
It's growing robustly in Ontario.
Well,
and Quebec and Manitoba, but it's not growing robustly in British Columbia.
Well, it's growing robustly here. We haven't got back to the... Oh, yeah, it is growing.
It's growing?
Oh, yes. We're growing very well in British Columbia.
Things are better
Growing.
here?
Growing.
Growing.
We went into a much lower trough because of the nature of our
that's
industries.
Right. Losing
here,
all our high-paid jobs and looking forward to sitting on the sidewalk selling lottery tickets.
Now, is that your unbiased view of that one,
No,
Jack?
that's a cynical view of that one.
Right.
Do you think he'll go after any of the personal benefits in tax for ordinary people, like the interest income deduction, $1,000?
I think that's fairly likely, Jack, because that deduction was brought in the first instance during the years of inflation to give people protection on their investment, because part of your interest rate, of course, is just protection from inflation. And I think that the government in the last budget made a move on the indexation side. I think that they.
What about the tax exemptions for those over 65? It's about $29.50, $25.90. He might go for that too.
I don't think so.
Too chicken for that. He won't touch the old age pensions, will he? And he won't touch UIC, will he?
Not at the moment, and I think that the changes that will be made in UIC, there will be changes in UIC, Jack, within the next 12 months. The changes that will be made will not, in my view, affect much on the revenue side.
Could he make anything by putting a tax on the incredible amount of gambling that's going on with roulette wheels and blackjack games and all the rest of that garbage? Bingo?
I don't.
That's tax-free at the moment, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't really know?
I don't know. No, I don't think anybody does know.
In that case, we'll go to the forum.
Now that we've established.
Go ahead to Michael Walker.
Hello, Mr. Webster. Mr. Walker, are you from the same Fraser Institute whose advice Premier Bennett followed in putting this province back on its feet?
No, I don't think that's clear to say. It is true that some of the things that we recommended showed up in government policy, but not all, and certainly everything that was done was not what we recommended.
The answer is partially. Go ahead. What's your next question?
Also, you mentioned about the fact of the UIC. It was 30% of the higher wage earners, and it's now 50%?
No, what I said, ma'am, was that of the benefits paid out under the plan in 1972, that was the first full year of operation of the new plan, 30% of the benefits went to people whose incomes were above the average. Well, by now it's more than 50%.
But isn't that partially due to the fact that we have more professionals out of work than we had before?
No, this is something that has happened on a structural basis right across the country. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that we don't have a trap built into the plan which ensures that people who in fact have got above average incomes don't get it. There's some attempt to tax back the benefits received by high-income individuals, but basically it's not effective enough. And I should tell you, look, this is not, my attitude on this is not just reflecting some kind of a conservative knee-jerk reaction or whatever. An interdepartmental committee of the federal government under the previous regime, in fact, recommended a movement exactly in this direction. They recommended that there should be a doubling of the tax back rate on unemployment insurance precisely because they observed that too much of this money was going to people who, by any sensible standard, really didn't need it.
Yeah, I agree with you to some extent because of the 2 checks to one family. When another family where the wife isn't working have to swallow the small pension payment and be denied unemployment insurance. Yeah. That was too rough. Thanks, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Walker, I'd like to have your opinion on Peter Pocklington's proposal where he said that every person would pay 20% income.
Just a minute. Do you want to go over that again? Flat tax, bad or good?
Well, flat tax is very good. It's the principle of it is very good. It's currently being reflected in the Rostenkowski tax measure in the United States. I think it's highly likely that the United States...
Not the Rostenkowski tax measure in the United States.
I think that it is very likely that the United States will move towards a flat type tax during the course of the next 12 to 18 months.
And we might tag along a little bit, but it'd be good for the rich, poor for the poor.
No. no, it's not. Jack, look, the tax reductions in the United States from 70% down to 50% that were brought about in 1981 have actually resulted in the top income earners paying a higher percentage of the total tax bill than they would have paid otherwise. And the reason is simply...
Fewer fiddles.
Fewer fiddles, but not only that, Jack, less benefit from fiddles and less benefit from illegally avoiding reporting your income. If your return is from not reporting your income is 70 cents on the dollar, you're more likely to do it than if it's 50 cents on the dollar. Let's face it.
True enough. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
I have a question for Mr. Walker. How much of each new tax dollar is needed to service our current national debt?
Well, if you had a, let me answer it in a slightly different way. If you imagine a dollar that the government spends, right now the federal government spends, 26 cents of that dollar goes to support debts acquired in previous years. So when Michael Wilson approaches the problem of cutting spending, it's important for us to remember that he starts off with only 74 cents
That's right.
of the spending dollar that he can actually tamper with. The rest of it is in fact going to
what should it be in the ideal healthy economy?
Well,
10 cents, 15 cents?
Well, that's the question, I guess, Joe.
16 cents in the States.
Thank you. 16 in the States. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'd like to know, was it 40,000 he said was the average standard of living?
No, he said that's the cutoff income over which people should be denied unemployment insurance.
Should be denied any so-called social welfare handout.
Oh, except for Medicare. What are you going to do about Medicare?
Well, now, Jack, that's another subject about which we've written 2 books. Do you really want to get into that? I mean, that's...
Do you want to cut back on the national participation in Medicare? 50,
what I would say is this, Jack, is that the National Health Act, which was brought in the last days of the preceding Liberal government, the effect of that National Health Act is in effect to completely eliminate personal participation or private participation in the payment for medical care. There is no longer a possibility for user fees, in effect, for extra paying by patients. There's no possibility for, and I think that is a disastrous, from the point of view of the future of our Medicare system, is a disastrous state of affairs. But that's all I want to say. I mean, it's really a complex subject.
Yeah, and we must have the national system, though, even if there were some user pay. We don't want to go to the American system, do we? Where you pay
it depends on. Let me give you a statistic, Jack.
Well, you impoverish people.
Let me give you a statistic. Oh, that's nonsense.
Health care for the rich and nothing for the poor.
You've been reading the Vancouver Sun.
No, I have
that's
not.
Nonsense.
I've been in the great United States, and it appalls me.
Less than half of 1% of the bankruptcies in the United States are due to medical
Only
problems.
an economist would come up with that statistic, I'll tell you. More after the break. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack, Mr. Walker. I was wondering if Mr. Walker could address the benefits of universality and the fact that there's no stigma attached to this social service. Also, the fact that if you are in a higher tax bracket, as he's mentioning in the over 40,000, the fact that you're taxed at a higher level, if you're by receiving this, it'll put you into a higher income tax bracket, so that therefore the monies would be returned.
Michael is not concerned with the lack of stigma in a universal program. He's concerned with the balance sheet of the government.
No, wait a second, Jack. That's nonsense. Look, we all make out the most comprehensive means test that you can imagine every single year.
Tax.
Our tax return we have to tell everything about our financial means and everything else. And all we're proposing is that same means test be used to judge whether or not people ought to receive money from government. I don't see anything demeaning about that. If at the end of the year you know at the end of the year you know what your income circumstances are. Most people know what their income circumstances are.
You need the UIC payment 5 weeks after you've lost your job.
Sure, and so you get it 5 weeks after you've lost your job. But if at the end of the year you turn out to have earned $50,000, then you pay substantially
double rate of tax for USC benefits. There may be something to it. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Walker. First a brickbat and then a bouquet. As far as being on a stage and trying to please the foreign audience and the foreign money exchangers on the Chicago Exchange and selling a citizenship for $250,000, I say to hell with the audience. Now, a bouquet. You're the most refreshing person I've heard on the economic situation in Canada for a long time, and I sincerely wish that Bennett or Mulrooney would put you on their, take your advice.
Watch it.
And perhaps we'd make a little progress.
Well, just
more power to you, Mr. Walker.
take a bow, Michael. First time you've ever been praised in the many years I've had you on this program. Go ahead from Mission.
Hello, Mr. Walker. I'd like your opinion on something.
Sure.
I work in the Beaufort Sea on the oil rigs, and I made last year $48,887. Now, after paying massive amounts of income tax because I'm single, and all the rest of the things taken off my paycheck, I ended up with $12,874. Now, are you suggesting that I can't get UIC after you've taken that great big chunk out of my paycheck?
Well, if you were in 48,000 gross and you ended up with 12,000 net, I suggest that you go and see an accountant because I can't see any way that under our current system you should have your income tax, your total income tax rate ought to be somewhere around 25% at that income level. So you shouldn't.
I've got income tax for you.
Beg your pardon?
I've got income tax here for $17,522. That's just the beginning without all the rest of the stuff taken off of it.
Yeah.
But you couldn't have dropped to 12,000 on a gross income of 48,000.
I've got it right here on my T4 slip from the company.
Oh. In other words, you paid, how much tax did you pay? 17,000?
522.
Well, that still leaves you 7 from 8, 130,000 net, doesn't it?
Well, I had the UIC taken off and all these Canadian pension plan and all the rest of the stuff. Some insurance taken off.
Sure. Yeah. No, there isn't any question that our calculations at the Institute show that if you consider all of the 51 different kinds of taxes that there are, that the average Canadian on balance comes out at about a 56% tax rate.
Yeah, but
there's any question
don't you think that's giving nobody any incentive to go and work in those harsh conditions up north?
Oh, sure, it's not giving you any incentive. That's why we're in favor of a flat tax. That's why we're saying you should pay 20% of your income or 22% of your income in tax, and after that, forget about it.
When do you come back up the Beaufort Sea?
When do I come back?
When do you go back up?
I go up the middle of April, come out around October. It depends on the season and the weather.
If you find any spare cruise missiles lying around, give us a shout. Much obliged. Go ahead from Solista.
Yes. Good morning, Jack.
Morning.
I have a question for Mr. Walker.
Yeah.
I'm in receipt of a Canadian Armed Forces pension.
Right.
And I'm on unemployment insurance at the present time.
Right.
And the question I have is that a few years ago, we were allowed to take our pension.
No, I'm not getting into detailed tax questions about the economy. You're one of the people who suffer under the new UIC regulations, but that's for another program another day.
Well, that's a very interesting point, though, Jack.
I know the point. I've dealt with it before. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Yeah.
I must say I echo that previous caller's comments and Dr. Walker, how fantastic his policies are. One question I've got, I understand our national debt on a per capita basis is approaching double that of the U.S. If something isn't done, what are the long-term consequences of the situation?
Well, you see, right now we're looking at what the short-term consequences are. I mean, it used to be that that economists had to point at what the long-term consequences would be, and we would have to say, well, look, if you don't do something about the deficit, eventually it's going to come back to haunt you in just plain economic terms. Well, now we don't have to point to the long term because we can see right in front of us what the effects of not dealing with the deficit are. The effects are that the government feels compelled to jack our interest rates up to 4 to 5 percentage points higher than they are in the United States in order to defend the dollar. The consequence of that is to kill off jobs, to kill off economic production. And it's quite clear what the consequences of not doing something about the deficit are.
Would that scenario include economic collapse at some point in time?
No, I'm loath to suggest economic collapse. I mean, there are all kinds of cases of countries that have limped along and struggled through with higher debt burdens than we've got. Italy, for example. But we're clearly getting to the point where we're putting a lot of our traditional economic institutions in some jeopardy. And the most important one, incidentally, that we're putting in jeopardy is the whole notion of, as we've been talking about our tax system and so on, is people's willingness to voluntarily participate in the tax system. And I think that the government must be at this point really looking at it in a very having a kind of a devil's choice between what they can do.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Mr. Webster, Mr. Wilson. Just kind of wondering how a person can trim some fat off the government, because in times of hard time, you'll find that a lot of big businesses trim down from the very top, and they start hacking away at the your frivolous expenses. Well, you get a lot of big businesses cutting off various other expenses such as your pension plans and so on and so forth, and yet the government doesn't. The government comes along and they'll increase taxes to the little guy, and yet they won't do anything with their frivolous expenses. And
here.
There's one thing that we have to make very clear. You said about raising taxes on the little guy. The reality is that as long as we have a pluralistic society of the kind we have, that all of the tax burden substantially is going to be borne by the middle class. The reason is because the middle class earns most of the income. About 80% of all the income earned in Canada is earned by people whose incomes are less than $50,000 a year. So whenever we talk about the government's expenditures and what the government is doing, we have to remember that it is the great middle class that is going to bear the burden of that. It doesn't matter what they do. Now, from the point of view of trimming and nibbling away, let me give you some references here that you can understand what kind of a problem Michael Wilson is facing as he tries to cut back the deficit. We said that out of $1 that the government spends, 26 cents goes toward the public debt. Now, if he wiped out the whole family allowance program, if he wiped out all of the services to government, which amount to about 3 cents, 2.5 cents for the family allowance program, and he wiped out the whole external affairs department and all of our foreign aid, he would then save in this year's budget an amount equal to the amount that would put us on a 5-year plan of reducing the deficit. In other words, if he did all of those things, it would still take us 5 years to eliminate the deficit, provided he did something equivalent to that in each of the next 5 years. So it's not a matter of nibbling around the edges. We've got the problems that we face in terms of cutting back are truly enormous. And it's our view that the only way that can be done is to go after some of these big programs, that 42 cents that's spent on social welfare programs, that's spent on old age pension, on family allowance, that's spent on people whose incomes are above the national average.
Middle class take care, right?
The middle class, Jack, is the one who bears the burden. It doesn't matter how you slice it. You can talk about not having any heart if you talk about about cutting back on social welfare programs. You just remind yourself, pinch yourself every once in a while, and remind yourself that it's the middle class who's going to bear the burden, however you slice it.
One thing I'd like to see them do is wipe out their own index pensions, the MPs, and never vote themselves another increase. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
Well,
as leadership.
Jack, I think that's a red herring.
Not
Frankly,
a red
that's
herring.
a red herring. It's a few cents. Sure it is.
It's an emotional thing.
Yeah, sure. It's
wipe out all these Piola Senate seats.
It's an excuse for talking about the serious things that have to be talked about. It's an excuse for doing something about the things that have to be done. That's what it is. It's an excuse. It's an alibi.
Well, what are you doing tomorrow?
Not an alibi.
What are you
red
doing
herring.
tomorrow? You cleared tomorrow morning?
Tomorrow morning? No, I'm on a competitor, I'm afraid, tomorrow morning.
Just as well, because you'll just get involved in all the detail, you know. We got the best of you this morning. I forget your name now. I'll be back after the break. All my years as a reporter and around prisons and hospitals and whatnot, I know perfectly well there's always been the problem of the sex offender. But we've had such an explosion of publicity about it in British Columbia, you wonder if it has really exploded or if we're merely becoming more publicly aware of the problems. I'm not going to refer directly to the Noise case where the sentencing hearing is still going on, but I've got to say it absolutely baffles me when you learn circumstances where a guy with an incredible problem can be shuffled around from school district to school district, from school to school for years and years and years and years. So in town just now for a forensic mental health seminar is an expert from the Oregon State System, Robert E. Freeman-Longo, Unit Director of the Sex Offender Unit, Correctional Treatment, Oregon State Hospital at Salem, Oregon. And I want to ask you, in the United States, have you had the same kind of conscious explosion of an incredible awareness and activity among sexual abuse, incest, pedophilia, etc., ad nauseam?
Yeah, we have, Jack. Back in the 70s, the topic was rape of adult females. But in the 80s, we've seen more of a focus on child sexual abuse. And there have been major cases, notorious cases, the Manhattan Beach School down there in California with little children being abused, and that's still going on at the tune of $4 million of court costs. And we've seen numerous cases throughout America where, and some notorious cases dealing with sex crimes of all types.
Is it worse, or is it merely this consciousness and the fact that people now stand up more to protect their children?
I think it's a combination of two things. One is that the problem has existed all along, and now we're acknowledging it exists. And when you develop services, cases come out of the woodwork. The other thing is that, in part, there's some theory that suggests that repeated abuse, repeated abuse, right, of individuals may lead to future abusive behaviors. And so as we're tackling this problem at this moment, what's happening is more and more people are being sexually abused, and these people run the risk of becoming abusers themselves.
The general feeling I get, having dealt with a lot of these people over the years and with the systems, is that there is no cure for anybody.
No, there's no cures in our business. I don't know of cures that are guaranteed in medicine or mental health, for that matter. What we can offer these people is intensive treatment and some very useful tools that if they do get released back into society with treatment, that their chances of reoffending are greatly reduced.
Surely the first principle is still the protection of the child in school or the child in the family.
There is no doubt about that. We have to protect children. We have to develop resources for victims when they are detected, and we have to begin to incorporate public education programs in our countries.
I'll get down to your specifics in a moment, but nice to get a fellow from the United States. Do you find there's a tendency, it has been a tendency in the United States, for parents with legitimate complaints to be conned out of going to the police on the grounds that, oh, it'll put your child through the absolute horrors and we'll make sure he never teaches again? And what should a parent do in these circumstances?
I think there's a false myth that many parents are led to believe that if the child goes through this trauma of having to go to court and report on an abuse case, that it's going to cause further harm. Now, a good worker with children, social worker, or child protective services worker can help guide that child through, but that child, like an adult, has the need to deal with their problems too. And it's a magnitude we're dealing with here. I mean, if you're angry, you need to deal with your anger. If somebody harms you, you want to deal with it. And the child is no different. Whether it's he's lost his pet frog or his best toy or he's been sexually abused, that child has a problem that they need to be dealing with.
So you're saying that it's good advice to parents not to be shuffled to the side because of some fancied fear your child will be affected by an investigation.
If a child it's been determined that he's been abused, my feeling is that child needs to be in therapy, and it's not going to be harmful in most cases for this kid to go to court.
Now, pedophilia.
Mm-hmm.
Have you dealt with that on many occasions? And what can you tell me about what should be done about pedophiliacs?
Well, we treat both rapists and pedophiles in our program at the Oregon State Hospital, and what we see is there's several theories in terms of the etiology or the causes of this. In a very small percentage of cases, there are biological causes, an organic brain syndrome or some sort of medical illness, maybe 5% or less of the cases. Another theory, and probably the more popular and widely accepted one, is this is a learned behavior. In other words, people want to take these individuals and throw them out of society and lock them up for life. But the problems began in society. The problems began in many ways, and one of the things we're beginning to see now is that the result of abuse is abusive behavior. So there may be a cycle that's developing here.
If a pedophile is involved with, say, 100 kids somewhere, a number of those children are liable to develop abusive behavior themselves in later years.
Over 60% of the men that I treat have themselves been sexually abused as children. In some cases, we see a very, very interesting linkage here, that what they are doing to children as an adult sexually is the same exact behavior that was done to them when they were a child. So there's a repetition compulsion, if you will, or a repeating of that offense.
Can they be conditioned out of it, or can some of them be conditioned out of it?
Yes, there are some men who we feel have, if they're long-term, if they're getting on in years and they've had a history of this behavior for 30 and 40 years, the chances of rehabilitation are very, very poor. Prognosis is very poor. But if you can get this behavior licked in the early stages of it. If you catch the person early on and get them involved in intensive treatment, there's no cures.
Are they willing to admit it?
Our men are, because we take our men from the prison system. They've already been found guilty, they've been sentenced, and they have to volunteer for treatment. And part of that volunteering for treatment is to take and make a statement that they're responsible for what they did, they are in fact guilty, and they need help. But a good number of these men in prison will still deny that they've ever done the crime.
Mm-hmm. So, just like if you've got someone on the outside, they tend, I understand, to be terribly manipulative and not to admit the behavior.
Oh, most definitely. If they're on the outside and they're in a court case or they're pending going to court, there's a great investment in keeping your freedom. And in part of that investment is to deny the crime, to minimize the crime, to put blame other than on oneself, to blame the child, to say the child's lying. There's numerous excuses we see. These men are highly manipulative, but that's a part of their pathology. They learn to control people. That's part of the power dynamic involved in this crime, and that's part of the psychological benefit to them, is to be in control of situations, to manipulate, to exploit others for their own benefit.
When you catch them, though, in outside society, do you have a system which keeps them when you find them out of the schools?
What we do in Oregon certainly is if it's a school teacher and he goes into treatment, we tell him right off the bat, this is it for your career in teaching. You need to follow a new career. We try and take pedophiles and say, number one, you have to acknowledge you cannot work around kids. You're not going to drive a school bus. You're not going to teach. You're not going to work in a playground. You're not going to work in a toy store. You're not going to work in a nursery school. You're going to trying to avoid children. It's like taking an alcoholic and saying, well, hey, why don't you go ahead and open yourself up a liquor store or work in a bar or a tavern or cater social functions. It's just putting the...
Well, our system fell down very badly. I don't know if your systems work, but right at the moment, most of us have no faith in our system for keeping these people out of the schools when they're found. Because you can't do anything until they're found. Well, wait, more questions for Robert. Freeman-Longo, L-O-N-G-O, after the break. Steady. Crazy. Well, I'm going to take phone calls this segment now to Robert E. Freeman-Longo, Director of the Sex Offender Unit, Correctional Treatment, Oregon State Hospital. Now, what do you do about like we eventually do, if we catch a pedophile teacher, we lift his certificate. Mm-hmm. That's about all you can do, isn't it?
That's about all you can do. I mean, you need to not put him back in the school systems, realizing this is a lifelong problem. I think people, like to think in terms of illness and cure. This is a problem these men will have for the rest of their lives.
A lot of the public think it's a waste of money trying to treat them, and you should just lock them up. And I notice that the recidivism rate for sex offenders, even in your system, is about, what, 80%?
For those men who are untreated and come out of prison, it's as high as 80%.
Untreated?
Untreated.
What does the treatment do?
If they're treated, we're seeing about a 10 to 25% recidivism rate, so it's greatly reduced.
Is group therapy better than...
We think so for two reasons. One is it's more cost effective, certainly, but the other is that these people are manipulative, and we've built on that model that AA has used with alcoholics, that these people know each other much better than we will know them as therapists.
That's right.
They know the deviancy, they know the problems, and they can go after their peers and point out that I've felt in the same way. I've tried to cover up my problems like you're covering up, and it's not going to get you anywhere. So we use that because we're very confrontive in our therapy.
You made a mention earlier on of learned behavior.
Yeah.
I didn't quite follow that. You mean behavior learned from being sexually assaulted as a youngster?
In part, certainly that. I mean, there's several things that can contribute to that learning factor. Abuse in general of a child, just physical abuse and neglect, and these things affect self-esteem and the social skills. And so these people grow up with a disadvantage that maybe you and I and viewers haven't had, of feeling insecure. They develop isolative kinds of behaviors. They don't know how to ask women out on dates. They don't feel comfortable in social situations. And so they turn to children to get these needs met.
Aversion therapy. I know we've used some of it in Canada, but you've probably been using it longer. Is it any good? And tell me what you mean by aversion therapy.
Aversion therapy is basically pairing the sexual arousal to deviant sexual behaviors like child molestation and rape with an aversive theme such as using a mild odor like ammonia, fumes and trying to create a phobic reaction or teach them how to suppress these desires. Another thing would be, say, electroshock, which is a mild shock to the wrist or to the calf.
Like they used to do for stopping smoking.
The same exact equipment is used in this case, yes.
In other words, you will deliberately let the patient be aroused by whatever device is necessary.
Right.
And then you'll give them a shock, a whiff of ammonia.
Well, we start pairing that in the initial stages of arousal at very low levels to try and get them to begin to not find pleasure in that. And then we begin to teach them appropriate sexuality and have them pair reward with appropriate sexuality. So in some cases it works, Jack. In other cases it's simply
Do you have any
ineffective.
indeterminate sentences for dangerous sexual offenders?
Some states in America still have that, but I think the majority of states now have moved over to a fixed sort of sentence.
Do they grow out of it? Like heroin addicts disappear in the late 40s and 50s. How many criminals just disappear in the late 40s and 50s? Do sex offenders disappear? Or is there a fair percentage of older sexual offenders?
I think with rape and rape behavior, you see these men beginning to burn out, if you will, in the late 30s, early 40s. With pedophilia, it's different. I've seen these people begin their deviancy as early as the ages of 12, 13, 14, sometimes earlier, and I've interviewed men in prison as old as 80 years of age.
And still active.
And still active.
Let's go to the phones. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. When I was about 8 years old, I was sexually offended.
Right.
And, okay, this is a long story, but it happened to me twice when I was a young kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I back then, you can understand, I was quite uptight.
Right.
2 years ago, I'm a professional. I work in a hospital. I was doing a normal procedure with a male person and was subsequently charged with indecent assault. Now, it's sort of like everything that I had built a little wall up in my mind that behind me burst forth to the pressure was tremendous. And I had a hard time dealing with it. Now, 2 years in court, lawyers, judges, police, the whole schmear, and I was proved not guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying, no, there should be, and I fully agree that sex offenders should be off the street and getting some therapy controls or treatments, but there has to be, out of all this that we're hearing, there has to be some that are not guilty. I just cannot, for my...
Yes, there are. In America, at least, we find that, like other crimes, probably 2 to 3% of the reports of child sexual abuse that come in are false allegations. A recent study was done by a colleague and friend of mine out of Denver, Dr. David Jones, and he found about 8% of child sexual abuse cases were false reports. But part of that was a parent falsely reporting and not just the child. If you got down to just the children, once again, it's this, 2, 3, 4%. And I'm not trying to imply here that everybody who's sexually abused becomes a sex offender. In fact, a very small number of those people who experience sexual abuse go on to become sex offenders. But of those people who are sex offenders, a very large number have been sexually abused. And so there's a difference there. What we need in terms of research in my field is really look at what those differences are. Why is it somebody who's abused does not grow up to be an offender, and other people who are abused go to that lifestyle? So that's needed research.
It may just be their particular genetic construction.
Well, it could, in some cases, be that. I think there's other parts of that social learning theory that need to be addressed. We don't know what it is. Intervention certainly is key. Years ago, Jack, there wasn't the resources available in America and probably in Canada. If you were sexually abused, that was it. You were sexually abused. Today we have child protection services. We have an understanding of this problem. We have great interventions, very well-trained therapists, and so we can intervene with a child at an early age and turn around this trauma so that it doesn't hopefully become a lifelong one.
Have you managed to reestablish yourself all right?
Oh, yeah, I am. It was very hard, and it's still hard. I mean, I was in national news from coast to coast, and the newspapers and everything. They never ever did put my name in, and I often wondered about that. But
you were lucky.
Yeah.
Well, it didn't matter to me because I'm still contemplating lawsuits over this thing, and I don't know. Sometimes I feel I'd just be better just to drop the whole damn thing and get on with my life.
That's the right advice, and you should take it right now, or you'll eventually become crazy over the whole business. Back after break. acceptance of deviant behavior, of course, has brought a hell of a lot of people out of a hell of a lot of different closets. Was it a good thing?
Sure.
Wouldn't it have been better to keep the old closets?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I think a point in time comes when we as a society or a nation or a province, in your case, or a state, have to recognize that this problem exists, and we can't sweep it under the carpets because you just perpetuate the problem.
Was there not less of it when it was underneath the carpet?
Well, no, there wasn't. I think it's been happening for many, many years. It's just that it's been covered up versus let out. So I don't think that we're seeing...
A lot of people suffered from a lot more repressions in those days because they couldn't come out in public with it.
When you open up to a problem and you develop resources, what you see is a spike. The reports go up like this, and then they'll taper down. And right now in Vancouver and BC, you're seeing this case pull all kinds of cases out. It'll level off. The thing one has to do is accept that the problem exists, and there's two ways to go about dealing with it. One is to ignore it, which won't work, and one is to begin to develop resources to combat it.
What about the profile of a pedophiliac?
Well, I think that many people...
Pedophile.
Yeah. Pedophiliac is fine, too. Okay. Most people, I think, view pedophiles as dirty old men, okay, if you will, or people who were lower-class citizens. And so when we see a case like this case here with the teacher, it throws people off. I have seen that child sexual abuse has crossed all social stratas and multiple races. I have personally worked with men who've had these professions: a major airlines pilot, an attorney, a chiropractor, a minister, a priest, a real estate broker, several school teachers, private businessmen, coaches for Little League. There is no one profile. It can be anybody, but it's the shocker when it's the government official. In America, there was a judge a few years back, a federal judge, that was charged with the sexual abuse of a 13-year-old female. And that's, you know, what people don't want to believe, that these people can do it. These are cornerstones of our community.
But you can't spot them in advance.
Not always.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack. Good morning.
Good morning.
I called in a while ago, about a month ago, on your show when you had the sexual molestation show on before about Robert Noyce. My son was sex abused last summer. He was 5 years old, and the pedophile was 15 years old. I told you at the time of the...
And I attempted, in fact, I think I got a little bit of action out of human...
Yes, you did, Jack, but nothing came of it. The social worker said, yes, they would go and check the family out. And I phoned him 2 days ago, the social worker, to see if he's done anything yet, and he said no, and he talked to his supervisor, and the supervisor said, hey, it's none of their business.
All right, I'll explain that situation to people. This is a case where a woman's child was molested by a 15-year-old boy who lived in the immediate vicinity.
Right.
Now, I had always been under the misapprehension that Human Resources would act at once, but Human Resources, charter is to act to protect the offended child at once, and they regarded your house as a safe place for your child, and as I recall, they blamed the police for lack of action on the 15-year-old, and the police, I checked with them too, have found it very difficult with this juvenile to find any corroboration for the offense of. So I'm afraid you've just got to let that one hang on the vine for the moment. I'm glad you called me about it because I now know the score.
Well, one piece of advice to the caller, too, is to make sure your child is involved in some sort of therapy and intervention. It brings up a good point, though, Jack, is that this is a problem that we need to begin to address in adolescence. In the surveys we've done of our men, several interesting points come out. One is this behavior began at the ages of around 15 or 16. This is not something that starts in adulthood, but it begins early on. And so treating adolescent perpetrators needs to be a focus in combating this problem. And we're not saying that we label these kids as sexual offenders or perverts and all that. We don't want to label the kids, but we don't want to ignore the problem and slap them on the wrist either. We need to get them involved in programs. When we see these nuisance behaviors, as they're referred to, exposing oneself, peeping into windows and making obscene phone callings, realizing that these could be the precursors to more serious hands-on sexual behavior. The other point that I would like to make, too, is simply that looking at the fact that it can be male children who are also sexually abused. Our data is showing that both male and female children are at equal risk, and that it's not just the female child, it is the male child who is going to be the target.
That's rather startling, isn't it?
It is. We found, actually, of the men that we're treating, 60% of the child victims were males. And reporting figures will show you that's about 20% because males don't report this crime. There's a lot of social stigma attached.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Jack.
Aye.
I'd like to make a recommendation and
Right.
come on very strong because I was abused by a member of our family. And it's left a deep scar on me. And I'm very, very angry this morning. I'd like to suggest that the experts that are in charge of our children be assessed on a regular basis.
You mean that they be checked for their sexual stability?
Exactly. And their emotional stability.
What are you saying?
Well, gee, that's I think more and more schools and programs that work with kids are taking more caution to screen, but we do have human rights.
But I know, human rights and the Charter of Rights, and we've got paid legal defences for every youngster from here to the Supreme Court of Canada. But the fact seems to remain there's been a professional snobbishness in the professions refusing to tackle the offenders within their own ranks. We'll hush it up. We'll
That
cover
is
it
the
up.
problem.
We'll
No,
hush it
and we
up.
can't do that.
We can't have that.
This case doesn't reflect on the school, meaning that all the teachers there are evil people, but recognizing that this problem can occur. And in America, we are seeing like agencies that work with kids, like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and child care facilities, screening and doing testing and taking a more active role to prevent these people from coming to these agencies because they, in fact, know it's a great source.
Thanks for your call, man.
Thank you.
Bye. After the break. Just for fun. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack.
To my guest, who is Mr. Wonderful name, Freeman-Longo. How did you get a name like Freeman-Longo?
Well, I married my wife, and she was the Freeman, I was the Longo. We couldn't agree on a last name, so we took both and combined them.
Oh, this is real liberation, Freeman-Longo.
Yes.
Whose name is first?
Freeman is my wife's last name.
Oh, she should be first. Should be Longo, Freeman.
It flowed better with Freeman-Longo versus Longo-Freeman.
Longo-Freeman, Freeman-Longo.
Freeman-Longo sounds better.
I'll go for Freeman-Longo.
Thank you.
Longo, funny name, Longo.
Italian.
Well, it's not funny. Oh. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack.
Yeah.
I wanted to make a couple of points. Number one, I think that the gentleman involved, penalties should be a lot stiffer. They seem to be getting off for a year, and then you know they're out after 3 or 4 months. And also, the very simple things like the children in advertising, they're really starting to abuse the children in advertising. They're putting them into more sexual, explicit...
Well, what was that famous model with the tight jeans? Shields.
Brooke Shields. Yeah.
That's an obscene.
I agree with the call. I mean, one is that, a short sentence is not going to help anybody. Prison is not a deterrent to sex crime. So if you're looking at it as getting the problem off the streets, then lock them away for life and pay that major bill of incarceration for 35 or 40 years. Otherwise, look at it as an alternative to incarceration treatment. Now, we're doing a 2-day workshop here, as you know, at the Weston Bayshore, which is open, and you can register at the door on treatment issues.
Sexual assault, rape, incest, and child molesting, the psychology of the offender. This is on February 27, 28. When's that?
It's tomorrow and Friday, and you can register at the door if you want to come.
How much?
Oh, it's $180 at this point, late fee.
180.
Any rate, the other point the caller made was, let me think back to it now.
Well, I've got a point I want to make.
Okay.
You say that you can't lock up sex offenders. Surely to God, surely to goodness, that 6 months in the local bucket.
It's a waste of resources.
Doesn't it teach me a little bit of a lesson? Who wants to be 6 months in a local bucket as a sex offender?
We have found with our men...
Look at the shame of it.
That isn't a deterrent.
If you're a professional man, for instance, or if you're...
So he moves from Vancouver over to Toronto, and he begins his career again.
Mandatory treatment should be part of it.
I think, you can't, if you make treatment mandatory, the problem is some people just don't respond, and that becomes a waste. I mean, voluntary treatment, I think, is important, but treatment is as an issue. 6 months in the clink is not going to stop anybody.
But you got to put them in the clink to give the parents of the molested child a little bit of social comfort.
What we found in American prisons is they have access to pornography there, sometimes child pornography, drugs, and they'll just fantasize and plan their next assaults. It's not a deterrent.
Unfortunately, I think if someone was to sexually molest a niece or nephew of mine or a friend, I would find it very difficult to hold myself back from not hurting the person.
I think we all feel the same way, and oftentimes I'm surprised that we don't see this. We have seen some men who've been shot, literally, by victims or by victims' families, but it's very few. The other point of the caller made was about the exploitation of children in the media, and we're seeing more and more of this, which is very sad.
Well, we're just
children
catching up.
they're being exploited as sexual beings.
We've got these 900 kiddie porn lines now, which you've been using down in the States for years. I'd like to see them taken off the system. But you can't because of this so-called phony freedom of speech.
Right.
What's wrong with freedom of decency?
Well, there's agencies that exist in America like the Renee Guillon Society who promote child sexuality. Their slogan is sex by year 8 or else it's too late. But because
Sex by what?
By year 8. Or
Sex by year 8 or else it's too late.
And they claim to have 8,500 members or better. So because of the constitutional rights, we have agencies that can go out and promote what really is a crime.
Yeah, we had a case like that in Toronto, too. Next one. I've just taken it. Williams Lake.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, John. Yeah, I would just like to give you a little bit of background of what Williams Lake has done and then give you some comments.
Right.
Okay, we started in about 81, 82 with putting on some public education and professional education with workshops. We've done 2 major and 2 smaller ones on treatment as well as awareness of it. We also formed a sexual abuse team that is just sort of more or less keeps the professionals educated and updated.
Excellent.
As far our worst link was treatment of the offender. We've got someone in town now that is willing to do some aversion and some treatment, but we find with therapy is that the offender will only tell the therapist what he wants the therapist to hear. And so at least my own opinion is that it's become more or less a cyclical thing, and that we have to start in the schools because a lot of parents aren't going to teach their children, and we have to more or less teach them what should they do if something like this happens, and what they should also not be doing when they grow up.
Well, you know, what happens too to the caller that if the therapist is just taking these pat answers, the therapist can probably benefit from some training and working with these men because they're manipulative.
Yeah, I agree with that. I also find that if you send someone to jail, and even if you give them treatment in jail, you've also told the child that the child more likely has been told, if you tell you'll be put in a foster home, I'll go to jail, which eventually happens. And if that father comes home, the child's never going to tell again.
That's the real harm, you know. We can't continue to victimize kids because of what the perpetrator has done. It needs to be very clearly that it's this man's fault. And if the man's going to be on probation, then I agree there should be mandatory treatment. If the man is kept in society, then by golly, make sure you have programs to treat this individual.
Congratulations to you and Williams Lake, my dear, and I'll be back with more with Freeman-Longo after the break. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I... Go ahead to Freeman-Longo.
Yes, good morning, Jack.
Right.
I'd like to go back to your conversation in the beginning when you talked with Robert Freeman-Longo, where he mentioned that dealing with the abuse at the time is the best idea. I found that I was abused in a foster home for 8 years straight in the Lower Mainland, and at the time when I did tell, I was not believed, and I did not even deal with it. I had complete self-denial until I was about 30 years old, and because of the fact they wouldn't let me deal with it at the time, meaning the social workers, the mental health center, the government, human resources, I am really going through a hard time now, and I really believe that children should be made to deal with it when it happens.
I agree. I appreciate your comments so much because, you know, years ago the resources weren't there, as we said, and now they have it. And we're seeing more adults like yourself coming forth at age 30, 25, 40, sometimes older, now dealing with it because it's been this horrible trauma that's been kept inside and locked inside for years. And I applaud you.
Are you winning?
I think so. It's a really hard battle, and I couldn't get much help in Vancouver. I found there's more help available in the States, and I'm not one for group therapy under what I went through and stuff like that, but I basically am starting to deal with it now.
Best of luck, and thanks for your call. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Mr. Webster, I thought you would like to know for your own information. There's only one place in BC that treats sexual offenders. That's the RPC in Abbotsford, which has a very low success rate. There's also one other place in Regina, I believe, that treats sexual offenders. Now, it's really hard for an offender, once he gets into the system, to get any sort of a treatment program. I'd also like to ask Mr. Longo if he deals with the families of offenders at all. There are no programs on the street for families who have a husband or a boyfriend who's a sexual offender that may need help dealing with what they have done.
Let me answer your question in several fashions. One is that I've been to RPC and realized that their program could certainly begin to use some more resources available to them for treatment. We consulted with Canadian Corrections 2 years ago as they were trying to get a program off the ground, and it was not funded, as I understand. Doesn't mean you can't turn around and do it now. I believe we do family therapy on a limited basis because we're inpatient, but I believe that we should begin to establish these programs on the outside once again. In the States, in the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, we have a lot of very good clinics for the entire family developing. And that is very, very necessary when it involves
Who pays for
incest.
the clinics?
The offender does. If it's outside, the offender does. And I believe the offender should be made to pay for his treatment and the victim's treatments. And we have a legal panel tomorrow night addressing those issues.
Here in Vancouver, that's the one at Weston.
That's the one at
Bayshore.
Weston, yeah.
Well, thank you, ma'am.
No, thank you.
Go ahead, please.
Mr. Longo, if I understand right that you said there was little or no cure for sex offenders?
There's no cure, but there's no cure in medicine or mental health I'm aware of for any kind of illness, mental or otherwise.
What can possibly be done, for example, if a sex offender includes murder?
They have probably the worst prognosis, sir, and right now there's very few clinics on an inpatient level that are beginning to even address that problem. And, you know, my personal philosophy is that it's not that somebody's not treatable or they're untreatable. It's just that we don't have the technology at this point in time to work with someone like that.
What he's asking, the mass killers like we've had here, they've got to be locked up and thrown away
They need to be incarcerated, and their prognosis is real poor for treatment, and recognize that maybe lifelong incarceration is the only way to prevent future assaults of that nature, no doubt.
Yes, because we have on record several people that are multiple offenders, and the ratio of repeats is astronomical, really.
Well, many of my men are multiple offenders, but they're not murderers, and there's a difference. We feel with some of those people we can make interventions, but there's two key ingredients. If they have multiple offenses, number one, and the age range of the victims and the sexes are vary. They're male and female, multiple ages, and they have a long chronic history, 20, 30 years, their prognosis for recovery is extremely poor at this point in time.
Thank you. And I notice you're also going to have a discussion at your forum on holding the offender liable through civil litigation. If he's got money, sue him.
That's in conjunction with Van Dam Associates out of Campbell River. It's open to the public at 7 o'clock tomorrow night at the Weston Bayshore.
Yeah, we'll put up a slip for it so that people can see. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack. I was wondering if your guest could tell me the incidence of pedophilia in females. It seems that we've been talking about all men, and I just wonder if it's prevalent in females.
Yes, it does. We don't see that many cases coming to the courts, however, because it's an easier crime, and it's not time to explain, to cover up on the part of a female perpetrator in terms of, say, it being child care and examining for bruises or injuries. What we do see among our men is that probably 25% have been sexually abused by female perpetrators. This is not exclusive to males by any means, but we do see the majority being male perpetrators from what we know right now.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Jack.
Yeah.
I'd like clarification from your guest. He mentioned that in Oregon, and I'm thinking in terms of teachers, that when a pedophile was diagnosed, that they were suggested they not work with children. Do they have a system whereby they contact the school personnel and report this? Unlike here, where it seems to stay in a medical file and no one knows.
I would think when this case, type of case comes to light, that the people are notified, because it's a matter of public record. When that person's arrested and charged, it's public record, and the school officials are notified.
Yeah, but you see, there's such an opportunity for a cover-up if parents are bullied into not reporting, and if teachers don't pass the word along through official channels that this pedophile has been active.
Well, we probably lack in that right now, too. We need to begin to work on making sure that these people are not put back into the school systems.
Yeah, you got to. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yes, yes.
Yes, I'm calling to say that the time that I was born, through the 60s, I was abused all through my childhood, from physical violence to sexual abuse. And the point I'm trying to make is men tend to repeat what has been shown to them, the abuse that has been shown to them as children. And throughout my growing up, after what I had experienced, I've never molested a child or hit a person or abused or...
In other words, you have managed without treatment to become a properly adjusted person.
Well, to a certain extent, of course, I'm sure I've been affected emotionally in one way or the other, but I've never harmed anyone or repeated.
Ma'am, I'm very grateful, and there we must leave the entire discussion because I want to put up the thing for the panel. Sexual assault panel discussion, February 27, 28, Western Bay Shore. Phone 682-3377 for information.
Okay.
And I've been a very informative guest this morning, Robert Longo Freeman. I've just changed your name from Salem.
Thank you.
And I shall be back after the break. Tomorrow, this afternoon, the budget, you know, gore on the floor of the budget if they go straight Tory. And I shall have some experts with me tomorrow morning, and I shall need them very badly, to explain and interpret the effect of this first real Conservative budget by Finance Minister Michael Wilson, which will start this afternoon, I think, at 1:30 our time. Back tomorrow at 9 a.m. precisely.
Expo 86, 65 days to go.
Examination of Michael Wilson's budget, tomorrow at 9 a.m. precisely.